Hi everyone, I'm just doing an online meeting to go through our peer review assessment process and to look at the rubric and some examples of assignments that have been submitted so that you get a good sense of what I'm looking for in terms of the criteria and standards. This is our peer review process that you go through as both reviewee and reviewer. So it involves preparing a teaching plan, undertaking your own self-review using the peer review template, meeting with your peer reviewer to discuss your self-review and what you would like from them in the focus of the review, having your reviewer undertake their peer review, and they will complete their review on the same template in which you've done your self-review, meeting again after the review to discuss and share the feedback from the review, and your reviewer provides summary feedback on that same peer review template. And then after that meeting, as the reviewee, you finalise your document by reflecting on the feedback you've received and creating an action plan for what you're going to take forward to improve your teaching. And then you go through the same process where you're a reviewer for your partner and they're the reviewee. So the documentation that you submit for the peer review assessment models that process. There's your peer review briefing document in which you have provided your teaching plan and rationale for your reviewer. There's your peer review template where you're the reviewee, and that contains your self-review, your peer review, the summary reflection, and your final reflection and action plan. And then you also provide a copy of the peer review template that you completed as the reviewer, which will show your peer review and summary feedback. You're on the copy of the peer review template, you usually don't have the final reflection made by the person who's the reviewee. That's something that's personal for them to prepare. Altogether, that should be approximately 2,000 words. Now, you can submit your documents through EES as 3 separate documents, which I believe is possible, or you can compile them all together into one large document. I prefer it if you put together a Word document because that's easier for me to mark and to provide the feedback. Using our Norfolk system. Our peer review template is based around 5 learning design principles that I hope will be evident from the kind of things that we've covered in this subject. Our first principle is clearly communicates learning outcomes and relevance, and that of course relates to constructive alignment, and that when we're designing a learning activity, we always begin from learning outcomes so that we're clear about what we want to achieve through that learning activity. And so, of course, as well as identifying learning outcomes that are guiding what we're doing, it's also important that we clearly communicate them to students so that they're aware of what they're expected to achieve and also how it's relevant to them. The second principle is that our content is relevant and structured to enhance learning, and this goes to one of the Biggs and Tang learning characteristics, which is that we're trying to help students to build a well-structured knowledge base, because that's important for them to have that knowledge base for when they're applying it in any kinds of real situations. So the way we're thinking about the content that we're teaching to students, it's important for us to help them to understand the important concepts and theories that are part of our subject matter, and how experts understand the structure of that knowledge. Our third principle is constructively aligned teaching and learning methods, and that goes back to our first principle of constructive alignment, and that our teaching and learning methods are aligned with the learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve through our teaching session, and that our teaching and learning methods are also encouraging students to do the things that are represented in our learning outcomes. So that brings in the constructivist notion of learning, that it's about what the student does that's in. Our fourth principle is monitors student learning and provides constructive and timely feedback, and that reflects the principle that it's important that we are checking on student understanding, and so that is also influencing our teaching as we go. So in some teaching and learning activities, you'll have students being very active in their learning and applying knowledge, solving problems, things like that. And so you will be getting a lot of feedback about how well and accurately they're applying their knowledge and their understanding. However, in some situations where our focus is more on presentation, we may not be getting a good sense of how students are understanding what we're telling them and how they're interpreting it. So in those situations, it's also important that we have processes by which we can get feedback from students on their understanding, and so we can also review what we're doing in our teaching so that we're able to address any needs that students might have for improving their understanding. The fifth principle is summarises and reviews learning, and that is an important part of any teaching session, is that at the end of the session we help students to summarise what the learning has been in that session, and that's likely to help them integrate that learning into their own knowledge structures and to make it more enduring for them. Now, sometimes we think about that principle in terms of how we summarise learning for students, which is one part, but once again, if you look at your Byzantine, you'll see that if we actually have students create the summaries for themselves, then that is even more significant for them and likely to be much more long-lasting in how they remember that knowledge and learning. This is our rubric for the assessment item, and I've just focused here on the first two parts of it, and in looking through the sort of examples of what I'm looking for, I'll really just focus on the first part, because the same criteria are mirrored throughout the whole of the rubric. So our first criteria looks at the peer review briefing document with your teaching plan and the self-review that you undertake of your teaching and learning activity. So I've just highlighted three of these different standards: the PASS standard, the credit standard and the HD standard. So looking at the PASS level, in terms of how you write up your teaching plan, what I'm looking for is just that you present the key features of what you're doing in the teaching and learning activity, and so essentially that would be an outline. At the credit level, you would also be presenting a coherent educational rationale for what you're doing. So your teaching plan, by being coherent, would describe how your teaching and learning activities, for example, are going to achieve the intended learning outcomes for that activity. And at a higher level, at the HD level, you'll be analysing the key features of your activity, and your educational rationale will justify why you have selected those kinds of teaching and learning methods, and that would be supported by being informed. It would be supported from the educational literature that is an appropriate way to go about achieving those learning outcomes. Similarly, for your self-review, at the past level, we're talking about essentially a description of the teaching and learning experience. In each case, you're going to be guided by the principles that I've just talked about that are in the peer review template, but at the past level, you're probably just giving examples of what you do, and you'll see here that your focus is more on what the teacher does rather than explaining why you're doing it or what the student is doing to learn. So, for example, one of the first category, if you're talking about communicating learning outcomes, you might say something like, in giving an example, you might say, I present the learning outcomes for the activity on a PowerPoint slide, but without really explaining why that might be a good way to do it, and how students might understand that. That's a fairly simple example, so obviously that would be a common way of going about doing that. But there might be other ways at a more sophisticated level where you're thinking about getting feedback from students about how they've understood those learning outcomes. So once again, that idea of checking on understanding. At the credit level, you're also giving a descriptive review of your design guided by the peer review template, showing examples of your teaching practices, but in this case you'll be explaining how your teaching demonstrates those principles using appropriate terminology, and your focus will be shifting to what the student does or how your teaching facilitates student learning. So you're providing, once again, a rationale for why you've gone about the design of your... At the HD level, once again, your self-review, the focus is on how you're analysing how and why your teaching demonstrates those different principles, and your focus is on how that facilitates student learning. You might be considered alternative ways that you could have gone about doing that, and so you're providing a justification for why you selected a particular approach, and you're showing that that's informed by references to relevant contemporary educational literature. Now in the next slides I'll be looking at examples that are on in our teaching module from assignments that have been submitted, and showing you the sorts of ways in which I've interpreted what people have submitted within those standards. Okay, so in this one I'm looking at a credit example which is for an online teaching activity, an online meeting, and looking at the first criteria, communicates learning outcomes and relevance. I'm only looking at the self-review aspect because the peer review usually provides a response both to the criteria and also to the self-review, so would be demonstrating similar kinds of ways of going about it. And you can look at that in the examples that have been posted in the module anyway. So you can see here that the reviewee is responding to those principles and the criteria that I've listed in the template, and in this case the reviewee is providing an explanation largely for the principles that are not being addressed. So you can see the learning outcomes are only available in the subject outline and at the beginning of each of the learning modules. I don't state the learning outcomes nor remind students of them during the online meeting. I expect that activities prepared for the online meeting will prepare them to achieve the learning outcomes and the purpose and relevance of the topic. So this is really an explanation about what the reviewee is doing in relation to those principles, but not really providing a rationale for how that will help student or learning or not. So the focus is really on what the teacher's doing rather than what the student is doing. Now, just in terms of that, I know a lot of people think of the learning outcomes as being the formal learning outcomes that are presented to students in the subject outline, and I think this is the way this reviewee is interpreting it. But I also think that it is important for each teaching and learning activity or session that you do, that you also think in terms of your particular learning outcomes for that session, so that it's like giving students a bit of a guide or a map to what's happening in the session, and it helps to focus their attention on what you're wanting them to learn. So I think this is something that it's useful to do for every session. Now, in some cases, people might go further and relate those individual learning outcomes back to the subject learning outcomes. So that's helping students to see the connections from the whole of the subject down to individual activities. So these are all things that can be done within your teaching, and that you might do, or the idea of going through this template is to help you think in terms of some of those things and how they support student learning. Okay, so in this case, this is a credit example, but the way this particular criteria has been addressed is more at the pass level standard, because the focus is on the teacher rather than what the student is doing in each of the elements is really just an explanation from that perspective. This is the same credit example, looking at the second criteria, organises and structures content to enhance learning. And you can see here, once again, the reviewee is responding to the principles on the template, talking about how they've structured the meeting. In this case, it may not be so much around content, it is around learning activities, which is good, and those learning activities are something that has been prepared in advance through pods for the meeting. So the review is exploring, in this instance, how the design does facilitate student learning. There is sort of talk about what students are actually doing and why. The core concepts and ideas to retain are reinforced when commenting on students' responses to the activities and to the poll questions. The activities are designed to create a real-life situation, which using GIS to address through specific situation. During the online activity, students are asked how familiar they are with the learning module, and so students are asked about their own degree. Students are obviously coming from a range of different degrees in this subject, and so the case studies are designed so that they do address different areas of interest in relation to those degrees. So there's quite a good explanation here about why the design, about the actual design, as well as an explanation of why it's like that and how that relates to what students are doing, as well as why. This is the third dimension, constructively aligned teaching and learning methods, and this is the HD example that's up in our module. And so you'll see here the person is providing examples to illustrate different points, so explaining how the teaching and learning activities are aligned to the verbs in the intended learning outcomes, and giving examples, demonstrate communication skills, reflect etc., and why or how they're achievable and relevant to learners. A good explanation of the learning activities, telling us what students are actually doing in them. The students are providing peer feedback to one another. They're provided with structure and criteria to provide the feedback. Throughout the activity, the teacher is engaging with each group by asking questions and providing feedback. So this is the kind of very active teaching and learning activity that I mentioned before, where through the nature of the learning activity, the teacher is able to see how students are understanding and applying their knowledge, and to be able to provide them with guidance about how to do that and to kind of correct any misunderstandings as she goes. So in some cases it can be easier to demonstrate these criteria more widely than in others. However, that isn't necessarily the important thing in it. It's thinking about your learning design to achieve your intended learning outcomes, and being able to explain that's important in the peer review. You'll see here another thing that helps to put this in the HD category is that this person's provided some references to explain the rationale for the design. The design develops student engagement through social learning activities and peer teaching, and it's referenced to Biggs and Tang in this case. So all of those things are something that makes this particular example at a higher level. There's no need, it's only a little bit of referencing. There's no need to reference or to over-reference. It's just when you're perhaps mentioning key theories or principles that you're using that you would do that. Your main referencing for what you're doing in your review will come in both the summary feedback and in the reflection and action plan, rather than necessarily within this review itself. Okay, so I hope that gives you a good way of understanding how to write up your peer review templates, as well as what you're being asked to submit. And I hope your peer reviews go all very well, and that you're able to gain some constructive feedback on your teaching, as well as give it to your peer partner. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the subject question forum. Okay, good luck. I look forward to seeing your peer reviews.